Could Ukraine become a casualty of war? As Israel's unrelenting assault on Gaza consumes the world's attention, Ukraine warns that Vladimir Putin is gaining an advantage. But after so many months of battle, is it time for Kiev and Moscow to negotiate? Or can Ukraine continue to fight with less international support? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Ukraine. Since February 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine remained at or near the top of most international news headlines. But on October 7th, that changed. Ukraine's staunchest allies, some of whom see Russia as an existential threat to the US and Europe, had their attention diverted to Israel and Gaza. And Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is worried. He has warned that one of Moscow's goals was to wait for war fatigue to set in and watch Western support, including weapons supplies, slip away. In just a minute, we'll look at whether Moscow is succeeding, but first, a look at what's happening now in Ukraine.
President Vladimir Zelensky raised concerns at a private meeting held in the Ukrainian capital for his country's EU accession. He told European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen that the war in Gaza steers focus away from the conflict in Eastern Europe. Zelensky regretted that this situation was working to Moscow's advantage, but confident that Kiev was in control on the battlefield. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, disagrees. He argues there's a stalemate over the war zone, and adds this static stage will allow Russians to replace military losses. He might have a point. The media reports Ukraine's recent counteroffensive in the south to be inefficient, and a recent Russian strike near southern Zaporizhia reportedly left 19 soldiers dead. If this stems from battle fatigue, as some Kiev allies believe, then a possible option would be to stop aiding Ukraine with weapons and funds. But Zelensky still believes the odds are in his favor.
I believe that today, indeed, the situation is difficult. I don't think that this is a stalemate. It's a check on the part of the Russian army, but before that, we did a lot, we had done a lot, we were in a difficult situation. They thought that they would checkmate us, but this didn't happen.
Moscow dismisses the suggestion of a stalemate, but calls Zelensky's ambitions absurd. In response, the Ukrainian president's army did apparently hit successfully a sea and port infrastructure of a shipbuilding plant in Crimea. Calling the attack successful was wide off the mark, say Russian officials. They report that 13 of the 15 missiles fired by Ukraine were shot down before causing major damage. There are reports the current stage of the conflict prompted US and European officials to hold meetings on a possible outline of what Ukraine might need to give up for peace. But neither Russian President Vladimir Putin or Zelensky are likely ready to negotiate. The current stance of the two leaders, in no mood to capitulate, could mean the war machine in Eastern Europe will continue for the foreseeable future.
Now, on Wednesday, G7 foreign ministers said they were united in their resolve to continue support for Ukraine, as well as sanctions on Russia. But with multiple times more people dying in Gaza and the threat of a regional war looming there, how much more is the West willing to commit to Ukraine? And what could a lack of commitment cost the West? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Berlin, Ben Aris, the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. From Moscow, Vyacheslav Matuzov is a former Russian diplomat and Middle East analyst. And from Washington, E Herbst, a senior director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Thanks all so much for being with me. E Herbst, I'm curious to get your take first, because you have been a strong proponent of U.S. aid to Ukraine. And you've said there's this lack of understanding on how important the Ukraine war is to, you've said, vital American interests. But given what's happening now between Gaza and Israel, should Ukraine still be the U.S. policy priority? And should Ukraine continue to receive, U.S. support to the tune of 4% of its actual defense budget?
Look, what's happening in Israel is a great tragedy. And understandably, Israel is conducting this military operation to uproot Hamas if it can. But Israel's life as a nation is not at stake here, as former Prime Minister Barak has said. Israel can easily deal with not just Hamas, but with Hezbollah, and if necessary, even Iran. And that's in part because we've made sure they have a qualitative military edge over all of its Middle East enemies ever since the Reagan administration. In the case of Ukraine, its existence as a nation is at stake. You've had very senior Russian officials in the Russian media talk about, quote unquote, destroying Ukrainianness. We've seen massive, massive war crimes committed by the Russians in Ukraine. And as President Biden has finally explained to the American people, Putin's objectives, his revisionist objectives, go beyond Ukraine. And if he wins in Ukraine, we have to worry about the security of our Baltic allies, our Polish allies, our Romanian allies. And Biden made that case to the American people from the Oval Office, and it's about time he did so. So the United States has the ability to support Ukraine to the tune of $37 billion a year. As you mentioned, that's 4%, a little bit less than 4% of the defense budget. And with that, the Ukrainians have destroyed 50% of the Russian conventional military capacity. That's an excellent investment in American security.
It seems, though, that the U.S. is now having to fight 3 very severe, I'll say, proxy wars. You're saying Ukraine should actually be the priority because it is an existential threat because of Russia. But then there's also now what people fear is Iran looming in the Middle East. That's also an existential threat to the United States. And then there are others that say that Ukraine is actually taking China back when China is actually the bigger threat. And all the focus should really be more on Taiwan and the South China Sea region to protect the U.S. Can the U.S. really be fighting that many threats and that large of a scale on those 3 fronts?
The short answer is yes, but let me parse that. One, Israel is the one who's fighting the war. And Israel, again, which has gotten extraordinary American support, as it should, over the years, is in a position to deal with all 3 of those enemies, although, in fact, as you know, we have aircraft carriers, too, in the Eastern Mediterranean, as a way to tell Iran back away. So we can do these things together. And as for Taiwan, it's notable that South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan itself has said if you want to deter Xi from committing aggression against Taiwan, defeat Putin in Ukraine. And that is absolutely right.
Okay, let's get the focus, Ben, back on Ukraine. If you can, Ben Aris, bring us up, to speed on the state of play, as it were, in Ukraine right now. And if you can help us understand, how is Ukraine's commander-in-chief there saying there's a stalemate, while Zelensky says Ukraine still has the upper hand, but will lose that upper hand if focus is taken off Ukraine and given to the Middle East instead?
Indeed. The problem is that Ukraine is heavily dependent on Western supplies, and it's been fighting this counteroffensive. I mean, there was this spectacular breakthrough in Kherson last September where the Ukrainian forces burst through the Russian lines and recaptured hundreds of kilometers of territory, and forced later the same month Russians out of Kherson across the Dnieper back into Western Ukraine, into Eastern Ukraine. But since then, there was a sort of pause while Ukraine regathered its troops, and we were waiting for all of those Western weapons, the HIMARS, the Leopard tanks to arrive. And during that pause, the Russians stopped pushing the offensive so much and built heavily defended positions. And that was ahead of the counteroffensive that was launched this summer. Now, the hope was that the counteroffensive would be another punch like we saw in September in Kharkiv and Kherson, where they would burst through the lines. But the Russians had invested very heavily into these defenses, and they've proven to be a lot more robust. And so now this counteroffensive after several months actually has not produced much results. I mean, I've seen the figure. The amount of territory that Ukraine has recaptured is something on the order of 20 miles, 16 kilometers, something around there. But it's not the breakthrough that they were hoping for. And that failure to make a spectacular success is feeding this Ukrainian fatigue, because it's raised the question that, where do we go from here? I mean, the Ukrainians are taking horrible losses, as are the Russians, of course. But now they're on the offense. The cost of those attacks go up threefold when you're fighting on the offense as opposed to the defense. And this has led to the top general, as you mentioned, saying in an interview in The Economist that it's reached a stalemate. And that stalemate can't be broken without the investment of more arms, more sophisticated arms. Specifically, he gave a long list of technology that they need, anti-jamming stuff. The promise of the F-16 is very important. They still haven't arrived. And doing a ground offensive without air cover is extremely difficult. NATO standard strategy is you send the infantry in with air cover, and Ukraine simply doesn't have it. And so this has started a lot of people talking and actually specifically asking the question, where is this war going to go? How is it going to end if there's not going to be a clear Ukrainian breakthrough and a victory?
Vyacheslav, has Russia gained the advantage that Zelensky was warning about here, having the world's attention diverted and having its staunchest allies, kind of backing off, not providing the F-16s, for example, still waiting in the field for more weapons boosts? Has Russia gained an upper hand?
Well, our Ukrainian front, it is obviously today, it is bothering Russia, but not on the level that it can be a decisive place. I think that Putin took into account all situation based on Middle East, because beginning of Maidan 2014 was after the strong answer from Moscow to the United States stop beating Syria. Because after the United States received all chemical materials from Syria and destroyed it in Italy, America tried to make a blow to Syrian army and to destroy it. Some conversation had place between Russia, President Putin, and Obama at that time, and American delayed its blow to Syrian army, and instead they punished Russia by arranging coup d'etat in Ukraine, in spite of the fact that after 1 year later there was planned elections of new president, of new parliament in Ukraine, and it was absolutely clear that pro-American forces, Tymoshenko, Yushchenko, will come to the power. All facts were given. And they, year before this elections, they arranged this coup d'etat. And that's why we consider that we were punished by the United States for our persistence in Syria.
Okay.
We don't let American army to intervene in Syrian situation. Now we have another point, because we understand absolutely clear that Ukraine is very important for new electoral period in the United States. 2024.
Okay.
And that's why it's on the same level. The situation in Ukraine is very important for the United States, and also it was important of Israeli goals in Gaza. What are the real goals? American-Israeli goals or not? Because I have a suspicion, I am not sure, we don't have any proof, but I think that it was made according to the deal of the century, that was made between Donald Trump and
Netanyahu and Saudi, yeah.
Benjamin Netanyahu.
Okay, let me, John Herbst.
That was the real reason for military actions now against Gaza population. To get rid of a population at all, to bring it to the Sinai Peninsula, and Western Bank will be replaced to the Eastern Bank. That's what Russian view on situation between Ukraine and between Middle East, between Gaza.
John Herbst, I saw you smile there for a second, almost laughing slightly. So, tell me why.
No, not laughing.
No, not laughing, but...
No, not laughing. Look, I think there's a misunderstanding here about what happened in 2014 and misunderstanding on the Maidan and understanding about what happened in Israel last month. I'll start with Israel last month. What we see here is not some Machiavellian ploy by either the United States or Israel to kick Palestinians out of Gaza. What happened was that Hamas conducted a barbaric attack, murdering in the most vile way 1,400 Israelis, almost all civilians. And
yeah,
Israel
I don't want to
felt
backtrack too far and change the focus to what happened in Israel. We know that is the U.S. line, and that's why the U.S. continues to be such a staunch supporter of Israel. But either way...
It's more than the U.S. line. Are you saying 1,400 people were not murdered?
No, that's not at all what I'm
attacks?
saying. That did happen, but the U.S., as many accuse it, tend to ignore the wider context and ignore the actual consequences of how these ongoing events play into what is happening now, especially in the power dynamics with Russia. But Ambassador Herbst, let me ask you, because if the United States, you feel strongly they should continue to support Ukraine at full power, but if they don't, and you know that there is fatigue spoken of, especially among European leaders right now, help us understand what you really think the consequences will be for the United States and Europe in particular if Russia does get what it wants in Ukraine.
If the United States stops sending significant aid to Ukraine, the Europeans may make up for that for a little while, but they would eventually also stop to send aid to Ukraine. And you would see a Russian takeover in Ukraine, maybe not the entire country, because the Ukrainians will fight, and they have mountains they can fight in. And Moscow will be looking for further steps it can take to undermine the security system in Europe, which means we have to be very concerned about a possible Russian attack on the Baltic states, meaning on NATO. And Putin would be betting that just as the West grew weary of supporting Ukraine, the West would say, well, do we really want to defend our Baltic NATO allies? That's the danger. And if you realize that Putin's ambitions are large geopolitical ambitions to reestablish influence across the post-Soviet space, and for that matter, the space of the Soviet Empire, which includes a bunch of NATO allies, then you realize our strategic goal is to contain Putin's aggressive foreign policy. And if that's our strategic goal, spending 4% a year of our defense budget on that is a bargain.
Okay.
And in Europe, this is well understood, especially in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Ben, I know you think that Russia's ambitions are slightly more limited than what some in the including Ambassador Herbst, seem to think they actually are. But I want to ask you about something specific, because I found it interesting that Ursula von der Leyen, at her last meeting with President Zelensky, really stressed that Ukraine is making great progress on its EU accession. I want to listen quickly to what she said. I think it's important here. Let's play that.
I want to tell you how impressed we are by the reforms you've made in the midst of a war. You should never forget you are fighting an existential war, and at the same time you're deeply reforming your country. You have reached many milestones, reforming your justice system, curbing the oligarchs' grip, tackling money laundering and much more. And I know that you are in the process of completing outstanding reforms. If this happens, and I'm confident, Ukraine can reach its ambitious goal of moving to the next stage in the accession process.
Yeah, Ben, I think it's important because I want to know what you think that is saying to Russia. When joining the EU brings Ukraine a step closer to actually joining NATO, and we know that remains a very specific red line for Moscow, what do you think Europe's line of thinking really is here? If it does pull back on its military support, are they kind of throwing a bone to Ukraine here, saying, don't worry, we're still going to support you, but in some other political form?
Yeah, Ukraine joining the EU is going to be incredibly difficult. I think this is partly driven by politics, in so much as Ukraine has made its turn towards the West. That was the whole thing about Euromaidan. It started off as an anti-corruption demonstration, but as a pro-EU demonstration, and then morphed into an anti-corruption and threw Yanukovych out. But on Maidan in 2014, there were a lot of EU flags. And the Ukrainian people themselves have turned to the West, and they definitely want to be part of what Europe represents, which is a better life. And von der Leyen is there saying, like, yes, we want you in, we support you. If you're going to leave Russia, then as your main trade partner, as your neighbor, and then turn to the West as your main partner, then we welcome you. But the actual process of getting in is incredibly difficult. I mean, she was naming some of the issues. And Ukraine has thrown itself into that, and Zelensky absolutely has put everything he has into making this happen. But I think it's clear to all observers that this is going to take at least a decade to do. The problems it has to overcome, the corruption being a large one, agriculture. Ukraine is an absolute agricultural powerhouse that will swamp the whole of the EU if it's made with free borders, no restrictions on goods. And we already saw that when Poland banned the import of Ukrainian grain in April because it crashed the local market. So the practical problems of doing it are very, very difficult. But von der Leyen's remarks there are aimed at Moscow. They are designed to show Moscow the support that Europe has to bringing Ukraine into its fold. But as I say, it's going to be an incredibly long process. I don't see it happening for at least a decade.
Okay. Let me ask Vyacheslav then, final question, and how you think this should end at this point. Because Russian analysts I spoke to before said it was all on Ukraine for refusing to come to the table and actually talk to Russia about what kind of peace negotiation could be made, which many assumed just meant ceding territory to Russia. But now we're hearing actually Vladimir Putin isn't that interested in talking to Ukraine anymore. So tell us where things are supposed to go as far as negotiations, potential negotiations are concerned.
I don't consider that now we have opportunity even to go on with negotiation and political solution of the Ukrainian crisis. It was possible 1 year ago, 1 year and a half, in April 2022, when it was an agreement signed primarily by Minister of Foreign Affairs Kuloba in Ukrainian and Russian Minister Lavrov, whom signed and sent it to Kiev for studying and adopting and approving this agreement. But answer came to Moscow from London. This answer was from Boris Johnson and then repeated by Mr. Blinken, whom they said that no negotiations with Russia before it was absolutely defeated on the battlefield. That was the answer. And now to repeat the same thing, it was 1 year and a half ago.
Okay.
My opinion, it is impossible. So I think that decision of this issue, crisis will be made by military means only.
That's tragic
no negotiations sphere for Putin here in Russia, and no political opportunity and framework for Biden in Washington.
Okay,
because it is really a very important, substantial decision.
Okay.
It was elections in the United States and in Russia.
Vyacheslav
They
Matuzov.
don't ignore the population.
That will have to be the final word. Very unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.